The old man sits by the harbor every morning at dawn, watching the fishing boats leave. He has done this for 40 years, and before that, he was one of the men on those boats. His hands remember the rope even now, though his fingers no longer close around anything with certainty. He was born in a small house near this same shore, the fourth of 6 children, in a year no one bothers to remember anymore except him. His mother called him by a nickname that no living person has used in 30 years. He was, at 8 years old, terrified of deep water and fascinated by it in equal measure, the way children are drawn toward the exact things that frighten them. He built small wooden boats and floated them in tide pools, watching them list and right themselves, imagining himself inside them, impossibly small, sailing towards something he could not name. That boy is gone. Every cell that made up his small body has been replaced many times over. The skin that felt the sun that summer has been shed and regrown more times than can be counted. The bones have remodeled themselves, calcium leaving and returning in a slow tide of its own. Even parts of the brain, once thought fixed and unchanging, have turned over their molecular furniture again and again across the decades. There is, by some strict material accounting, nothing left of that boy. Not one atom of him survives in the body of the old man on the harbor wall. And yet, the old man remembers the fear of deep water. He remembers his mother's voice, though he could not tell you the mechanism by which a voice becomes a memory, only that it is there, waiting, the way it has always been there. He remembers the boats he built and the particular satisfaction of watching something small survive a wave that should have swallowed it. When he closes his eyes, he does not feel like a stranger inspecting a dead man's inventory. He feels like the same person, continuous, unbroken, though he cannot say what exactly has continued. There is an old puzzle about a ship. A hero's ship kept in harbor long after his death, repaired plank by plank as the wood rots, until eventually every original piece had been replaced. The people who tend it call it the same ship. They point to it and say its name, the name it has always had. But is it? If you gathered all the old planks, the ones removed over the years, and built a second ship from them, which one would be the true ship? The one with the name and the history, made of entirely new wood? Or the one built from the original material, but only now assembled, having spent decades scattered in a woodpile? The old man has never heard this puzzle stated so plainly, but he has lived inside it his entire life without knowing its name. He was 19 when he first went out on the boats for real, not the toy ones from the tide pools, but a working vessel, salt-cracked and groaning, captained by a man who barely spoke to him for the first 6 months except to correct his knots. He remembers the exhaustion of it, the way his body ached in ways it had never ached before, the way he wanted more than once to quit and go home and never see the water again. He did not quit. He does not fully know why. Some decisions get made by a version of yourself that the later versions simply have to live with, the way a country lives with a treaty signed by a government long since voted out of office. Is the 19-year-old who refused to quit the same person as the 8-year-old who was afraid of the water? They share no cells. They share, perhaps, no single memory that both would recognize identically, since even memory is not a recording but a reconstruction, rebuilt slightly differently each time it's accessed, like the ship being replanked every time it leaves harbor. And yet something moved from one to the other. Some thread was passed hand to hand, like a relay racer passing a baton, except the racer's whole body changes between one leg of the race and the next. He married at 26. He does not remember, if he's honest, the exact texture of that day the way he remembers the tide pools. Memory does not preserve evenly. Some days are kept in perfect fossil detail, and others, days that felt enormous while they were happening, dissolve almost entirely, leaving only a residue of feeling behind, a warmth or an ache with no image attached to it. His wife's laugh, though, that he kept. Not a recording of it, but something like a recipe for it, so that even now, decades after she died, he can conjure something in his mind that feels like her laughter, close enough to bring tears. though he knows, in the part of his mind that is honest with itself, that it is not really her laugh anymore. It is his memory's best attempt at her laugh, revised and re-revised with each remembering the way each plank of the ship is not the original tree but a reasonable substitute for it. Is this a loss? He used to think so. He used to lie awake certain that he was failing her, that the woman he pictured was becoming less and less accurate, a copy of a copy, degrading with each generation like an old photograph rephotographed too many times. Now older, he thinks differently. He thinks that this is simply what it means to carry someone. Not to freeze them, but to keep rebuilding them, plank by plank, in the harbor of his memory, so that something recognizable as her keeps sailing, even if no single board of her is original anymore. He raised 2 children in a house up the hill from where he was born. He does not remember most of their childhoods in continuous narrative, the way one might imagine a life should be remembered. He remembers fragments. A fever in the night. A laugh at a dinner table, a door slammed by a teenager who is now impossibly a grown woman with children of her own. Between these fragments there is simply absence, no record at all, years compressed into the space of an afternoon's recollection. If identity depends on unbroken memory, he lost himself 1,000 times over during those years and simply didn't notice the gaps, the way a film reel missing every 100th frame still looks, to the eye, like continuous motion. Perhaps that is the answer. Perhaps identity was never a thread at all, but something more like the illusion of motion in a film. Each frame is a completely separate image, no frame touching any other, no material connecting one still photograph to the next. And yet run them together and a man walks across a room. Nothing in any single frame is moving, and yet the whole appears to move. Perhaps this is what a life is. Not a continuous ship sailing unbroken from birth to death, but a sequence of almost identical stills, each one slightly different from the last, giving the appearance of a single sailor at the helm the whole way through, when in fact the helm has changed hands 10,000 times, so gradually that no single handoff was ever noticed. The old man on the harbour wall does not find this thought frightening, though he once might have. There was a time, in his 40s, when the idea unsettled him badly. He remembers, in one of the well-preserved fragments, a night he could not sleep, turning the thought over and over: if I am not the boy who built those boats, if that boy is simply gone, unrecoverable, replaced by 100 subsequent selves, each one slightly more of a stranger to the original than the last, then who exactly is afraid of dying? Whoever it is, they are not the person who was born. That person already ended quietly, sometime in adolescence, perhaps without ceremony, without anyone noticing the funeral. But the fear did not resolve itself through argument. It resolved itself the way most things resolve themselves for the old man, which is to say, slowly, and mostly through living rather than through thinking. He came to notice that the boy who feared deep water and the man who spent his life on it were connected by something sturdier than sameness. They were connected by inheritance. Each version of him received the previous version's fears, its loves, its unfinished business, and did something with them, carried them forward, modified, the way the ship carries its name and its shape forward even as its wood is entirely renewed. The name persists. The shape persists. The story persists. Perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that was always going to have to be enough for any of us. He is 81 now. His hands shake slightly around his coffee cup. He has outlived his wife, most of his friends, one of his brothers, and, in a sense, every single version of himself that ever existed before this morning. The ship in the old story never stopped sailing, not for one single day, even while every plank of it was replaced. Perhaps that is the answer to the question no one can quite settle. Perhaps identity was never in the wood at all. It was in the sailing. There is more to how he arrived at this wall than the ship puzzle alone can hold further back and later than a single morning's reflection first suggested. Before he was the old man on the harbour wall, he was a boy who did not know he would ever become one. This is worth saying plainly, because it is the thing no child believes, not really, no matter how many times he is told. He believed at 8 that the boy he was would simply continue unaltered into some vague and distant future, the way a road continues past the edge of what you can see. He did not know that the road would not simply continue. He did not know that it would be traveled mile by someone who kept changing shape as he walked it, until the traveler at the far end bore almost no resemblance to the one who had set out. The house he was born in stood 2 streets back from the water, close enough that on stormy nights the walls seemed to hum faintly with the sound of the waves, though this may only be something he added to the memory later, the way memory does, filling in details a scene surely must have had, whether or not it actually did. He was the 4th of 6 children, which meant he was neither the one who got the new clothes nor the one who got the fussing attention reserved for the baby. He existed in the middle of the family the way a keel exists in the middle of a ship, unglamorous, load-bearing, essential, unnoticed. His mother had a way of saying his name that no one else ever quite managed, a particular lift at the end of it, as though she were always slightly asking a question of him even when she wasn't. He has spent decades trying to describe this sound to himself in the privacy of memory and has never fully succeeded, which troubles him less now than it once did. Some things are not meant to survive as facts. They are meant to survive as a feeling with no fixed shape, like heat radiating from a stove long after the stove itself has been hauled away and scrapped. His father worked with his hands in a way that left him permanently smelling of tar and rope fiber, a smell the boy associated so completely with safety that he did not, until much later in his life, understand that other children did not feel this way about the particular smell of their own fathers. Every childhood constructs its own private religion out of scents and sounds that mean nothing to anyone else and everything to the person who lived inside them. There is a day, early, that the old man returns to more than any other, though he could not tell you why this day and not some other, equally unremarkable on the surface. He was perhaps 6. He had wandered against every instruction down to the tide line alone, and a wave larger than he expected had come in fast and knocked him flat, filled his mouth and nose with salt, dragged him a few feet across the wet sand before his father's hand closed around his arm and hauled him upright, coughing, terrified, alive. He does not remember the fear, not directly, not as fear feels when you are inside it. What he remembers is the version of the fear that got stored afterward, cleaned up, given a shape a mind can hold on to without being overwhelmed by it every time it's retrieved. This is something he did not understand as a child and only came to understand much later, reading, in his 50s, an article that a grandson had left open on a screen in the kitchen about how memory is never a photograph. It is reconstructed each time it is recalled, rebuilt from fragments stored in different regions of the brain, and each act of rebuilding introduces small changes so that the memory a person holds at 80 is not the memory they formed at 6, but the memory of the memory of the memory, revised at every retelling. The way a story passed mouth to mouth across a village changes slightly with each teller, without any teller lying, without any teller even noticing the change. He found this unsettling at first. It seemed to mean that nothing of his actual childhood survived at all, that even his most treasured memories were, at best, elaborate forgeries his own mind had produced and then, having produced them, sincerely believed. But the more he sat with the thought, the more he came to feel that this was not a diminishment. A forgery implies an original that has been lost and a fraud perpetrated in its place. But there was no original sitting somewhere in a vault, waiting to be compared against the copy. There was only ever the copy, the mind's best living account of what mattered, continuously rebuilt, the way the ship in the old story is continuously rebuilt, plank replacing plank, until asking which version is the real ship stops being a meaningful question and becomes instead a kind of category error, a demand for a thing that was never there to begin with. He grew. This is the part of every life that resists narration, because growth does not happen in scenes, it happens in the space between scenes, in the years a person spends simply accumulating days that do not distinguish themselves from one another. He went to a small school with a teacher who beat time on the desk with a wooden ruler when the class recited multiplication tables. He had 2 brothers older than him and 1 younger, and 2 sisters, 1 older and 1 younger, and the house was loud in the particular way of houses with 6 children and 1 set of exhausted parents, loud with argument and loud with laughter, often within the same 5 minutes, often over the same dispute. At 12, he began to understand, dimly, that he would not always be a child. This understanding did not arrive as a single revelation, but as a slow accretion of small griefs, a toy set aside because he had, without noticing the exact day it happened, become too old for it, a friendship with a boy down the lane that quietly ended, not through any fight, but through the simple divergent drift of 2 people who had once wanted the same things and had begun, without either one deciding it, to want different things instead. He did not yet have language for what was happening to him. He only had the feeling of it, a persistent, low-grade sense of loss threading through days that were, by any outward measure, ordinary and even happy. It was his older brother, the second-born, who first said something to him that the old man has never forgotten, though he cannot recreate the exact words, only the shape of the meaning filtered now through 70 years of retelling. They were sitting on the sea wall at dusk, the brother perhaps 16 at the time, already talking with the studied gravity of someone recently old enough to feel he had earned the right to have opinions about life. He said something to the effect that a person is not one thing all the way through, that you become a stranger to yourself many times over before you die, and that the trick, if there was one, was not to fight this but to be on decent terms with each stranger as he arrives, since you would be spending the rest of your life in his company whether you liked him or not. The boy did not understand this at the time. He understands it now, at 81, more completely than he understands almost anything else he was ever told. His brother died young, in his 20s, in an accident on a boat not unlike the ones the family had always worked, and the loss carved something into the boy that never fully closed over, the way a scar does not disappear but becomes instead a permanent, quieter part of the skin. He thought of his brother's words often in the years that followed, turning them over the way one turns over a stone worn smooth by handling. Be on decent terms with the stranger who arrives. He did not always manage this. There were versions of himself he arrived at across the decades that he did not like very much, versions that were cruel in small ways or afraid in ways that made him withhold love from people who deserved it freely given, or simply dull, worn down by repetition, going through days the way a machine goes through a cycle it has run so many times it no longer needs a mind attending it. He was not always kind to these versions of himself in retrospect. He judged them, sometimes harshly, from the vantage of later selves who felt they knew better. But he has come, in his old age, to feel that this judgment was itself a kind of family quarrel, one part of a continuous lineage scolding an earlier part for sins that, at the time, seemed like the only reasonable response to the circumstances then in front of him. There is a philosopher whose name the old man learned only late in life from that same grandson who was fond of leaving articles open on screens throughout the house as though seeding the place with small provocations, who wrote that personal identity is not a matter of some persisting soul or substance moving unchanged through time, but a matter of connectedness, a chain of overlapping memories, intentions, and psychological continuities, each link resembling the one before it closely enough that we are willing to call the whole chain a single person, even though the first link and the last link might, placed side by side with nothing between them, look like 2 entirely different people. The old man found something honest in this account, something that matched his own lived sense of things far better than any story about an unchanging soul ever had. He had never felt himself to be an unchanging soul. He had felt himself to be exactly what this philosopher described, an unbroken chain, forged link by link, no single link identical to its neighbor, and yet each one holding fast to the ones on either side of it. He left school at 14, as most boys of his circumstance did, and went to work, first mending nets, then eventually aboard the boats themselves, apprenticed under men who treated instruction as an insult to be avoided and correction as the only teaching method worth using. He learned to read weather in the color of the sky before anyone bothered to explain the physics of it to him, learned the particular smell that preceded a storm still hours distant, learned to trust his hands to do things his conscious mind had not yet been informed of, the way an old sailor's hands will tie a knot correctly while the sailor himself is thinking of something else entirely, his fingers apparently possessing a memory independent of and faster than his mind's. He was 19 when he went out for the first time on a real working vessel under a captain named Aldrich, a broad, silent man who communicated primarily through disapproval, his praise so rare that the one time in 6 months he offered a single grunt of approval after the boy correctly read an incoming squall 2 hours before it arrived. The boy treasured it the way another young man might treasure a medal. He does not remember, in continuous detail, most of the individual days of that first year at sea. What he remembers is a texture, an atmosphere, exhaustion so complete it felt like a kind of purification, hands so raw from rope that he could not fully close them by the end of most weeks, a loneliness that surprised him, since he had grown up in a house so full of siblings that solitude had been a foreign country to him, and now here he was surrounded by men, more alone than he had ever been in his life because none of these men knew him, none of them cared to, and he had not yet learned how to be known by strangers. There was a storm in his second year that the old man has never spoken about easily, even now, even to his own children in their turn. The boat had gone out despite Aldrich's own private hesitation, a hesitation the boy only learned of afterward because the season's catch had been thin and the crew needed the money the way a starving man needs food, needs it badly enough to take a risk a well-fed man would never take. The storm came faster and harder than the forecast had suggested, and for several hours that the old man still, at 81, cannot fully account for in linear memory, the boat was simply fighting to survive, water coming over the rails faster than it could be bailed. One of the older hands swept nearly overboard and caught only by the strap of his own oilskin snagging on a cleat. The boy himself certain, at one specific moment he does remember with total clarity, a moment outside of the general chaos, that he was going to die, and surprised in that moment, not by fear but by a kind of clean, cold clarity, a sense of his whole life laid out behind him like a wake behind a boat, visible all at once in a way it had never been visible while he was living it forward. He did not die. The boat came home, battered, one man with a broken arm, all of them soaked through and shaking, and Aldrich, once they were tied up safe, did something none of the crew had ever seen him do. He sat down on the deck right there among them, and put his head in his hands, and said nothing for a long time. The boy understood, watching this, that the captain had been as frightened as any of them, perhaps more so, since command means carrying the fear of everyone under you in addition to your own, and yet had not shown it once during the hours it mattered. He thought about this for years afterward. He thinks about it still. There is a version of courage, he came to believe, that has nothing to do with the absence of fear and everything to do with the timing of when you allow yourself to feel it. Something in him changed after that storm, though he could not have named the change at the time and can only name it now, retrospectively, with the borrowed vocabulary of much later reading. The 19-year-old who went out on that boat and the 19-year-old who came back were, by any honest account, not quite the same person, though they shared a birthday and a name and every material particle then present in either body. Something had been added that could not be subtracted again, the specific, embodied knowledge of one's own mortality, not as an abstract fact but as a texture felt in the chest at 3 in the morning for months afterward, a texture that eventually faded into the general background of a life but never fully vanished. He would draw on it. He realizes now at every subsequent moment in his life that required him to look at death without flinching, including, though he could not have known this at 19, the years he would eventually spend nursing his wife through her final illness, and the years, now, in which he waits, without dread exactly, but without illusion either, for his own turn to come. He married at 26 a woman named Maren, whom he had known since childhood in the glancing way one knows the other children of a small harbour town, without particular attention, until a specific autumn when attention arrived all at once, the way weather arrives, no warning, and then suddenly everything is different. He does not remember, in the kind of narrative detail a story demands, the day he realized he loved her. What he remembers, again, is texture, an evening walking her home along the sea wall, an ordinary evening in every outward respect, made suddenly unbearable in its ordinariness, so that he found himself wanting the walk to never end, wanting the particular grey light of that particular evening to hold itself in place forever, which of course it did not. Evenings never do, and yet something of that evening's specific quality of light has stayed lodged in him for 55 years, retrievable at will, though he could not tell you, if pressed, whether the sky that evening was actually the colour he remembers it being, or whether his memory, asked over and over across 5 decades to produce that sky, has simply gotten better and better at producing something that feels true rather than something that is true, the two having become, by now, functionally indistinguishable from the inside. There is a philosopher from centuries earlier than the one the grandson introduced him to, an older thinker who argued that the self is nothing more than a bundle of perceptions, one following another in rapid succession, and that when we search for some further thing, some essential self standing behind and unifying all these perceptions, we find, on close inspection, nothing at all, only the perceptions themselves, following one another the way one wave follows another, none of them the ocean itself, only its momentary surface. The old man did not encounter this argument until he was well past 70, and when he did, sitting with it in the quiet of his kitchen on a winter afternoon, he felt something close to vertigo, a kind of intellectual seasickness, the ground of his own selfhood seeming to give way beneath the argument's careful logic. But the vertigo passed, as vertigo does, and what remained afterward was something stranger and, in its way, more peaceful, an acceptance that perhaps there had never been a solid ground to begin with, that the search for an unchanging self behind the changing perceptions had always been a search for something that did not exist, in the way a search for the horizon is a search for a thing that recedes exactly as fast as you approach it, not because it is hiding from you, but because it was never a place at all, only a description of where sky and sea appear, from any given vantage, to meet. He and Maren had their first child, a daughter, when he was 28. He remembers holding her for the first time with a clarity that surprises him, given how much else from that period has faded, the astonishing lightness of her, far lighter than he had somehow expected a whole human being to be, and a fear that arrived instantly and never fully left him for the rest of his life, a fear specific to parents, that he has since learned every parent feels and no parent ever fully describes to the ones who come after, because word cannot quite carry the size of it. He was, in that moment, holding his daughter for the first time, a different man than he had been an hour before, in a way that felt more total and more sudden than any of the gradual changes that had shaped him up to that point. Some transformations, he came to understand, do not happen plank by plank. Some happen all at once, a single new plank so large it changes the whole shape of the vessel in an instant, even though the vessel afterward will still need all the slow plank-by-plank maintenance that every other stretch of the voyage requires. His son came 2 years later, and where his daughter had made him instantly a different man, his son, he has always felt slightly guilty admitting even to himself, made the change more slowly, the way most changes are made, an accretion of small moments rather than one enormous one, teaching him to tie knots on the back step, teaching him to read the sky the way Aldrich had once taught him, watching him fail and fail again at something and refuse, with a stubbornness the old man recognized uncomfortably as his own, to ask for help. The years of raising these two children do not exist in his memory as a story with a beginning, middle, and end. They exist as a great compressed mass, a decade and a half reduced in recollection to perhaps 24 scenes that stand out with any clarity, surrounded by a vast penumbra of ordinary days that simply did not get filed away as memorable at the time and are, therefore, permanently lost, not stored somewhere waiting to be recovered with enough effort, but genuinely gone, the way a wave that never broke against anything leaves no mark on the shore. He does not find this as troubling as he once might have. He has come to think of a life less as a film strip, every frame preserved in order, and more as a handful of photographs taken by someone who was usually too busy living to remember to take more of them, so that childhoods and marriages and whole careers get represented, in the end, by a modest handful of images, the rest inferred, reconstructed, taken on faith. Maren fell ill first in her 60s, a slow illness that took years to run its course, years during which the old man learned a form of love he had not previously known himself capable of, a love built not on shared adventure or shared pleasure but on the unglamorous daily work of tending to a body that was failing, of managing medications and appointments and the particular indignities that illness imposes on people who have spent their whole lives being capable and are now, suddenly, not. He does not like to dwell too long on these years even now, not because they were without meaning, but because the meaning they contained was heavy in a way that still costs him something to lift, even in memory, even this many years later. She died on a spring morning, quietly, in the bed they had shared for most of 5 decades, and he was there, holding a hand that had grown thin and papery in a way that still did not fully match, in his mind, the strong hand he remembered holding on their wedding day, the hand that had once helped him mend nets, the hand that had, God, decades ago now, reached for his under a table at a dinner with people whose names he can no longer recall, a small private gesture meant to communicate something neither of them could have said aloud in that company. That hand and this hand, the young hand and the dying hand, were not, in the strictest material sense, the same hand at all. Every cell of it had turned over many times across those 50 years. And yet he had never once, holding it at the end, felt that he was holding a stranger's hand instead of hers. Whatever persisted between the young hand and the old one was not made of the same atoms. It was made of something else, something he has never found the precise word for, though inheritance comes closest, or perhaps continuity, or perhaps simplest of all, just the word story, since a hand belongs to a story the way a plank belongs to a ship, not because the wood itself is sacred, but because of what the wood has been asked, across the years, to carry. He did not sleep well for a long time after she died. This is when the old unsettled feeling from his 40s returned to him with new force, the feeling that had once kept him awake wondering whether he was even the same man who had built toy boats in tide pools as a child. Except now the question had a sharper edge to it because it was no longer only about himself. It was about her. If he was not the same man who had married her, if the version of him holding her hand at the end was built from entirely different material than the version who had first loved her, then in what sense had he loved the same woman all the way through? Had he, in some strange sense, fallen in love with her many times, each time a slightly different man loving a slightly different woman, the whole marriage less a single continuous love than a long relay of similar loves passed hand to hand across 50 years, no single runner ever quite the same as the one before? He turned this thought over for months, in the particular insomniac hours when the mind is least defended and most likely to arrive somewhere honest, whether the destination is comforting or not. And what he arrived at eventually was something like peace, though it took its time coming. He decided that even if this account were true, even if he had loved her across 50 small relays rather than one unbroken sprint, this did not diminish what had happened between them. If anything, it deepened it. It meant that dozens of different versions of him, across 5 decades, each one distinct, each one shaped by a different set of circumstances and a different accumulation of memory, had independently and repeatedly chosen her, had looked at whatever version of her existed at that particular moment, herself equally transformed by the passing years, and had chosen, again and again, without needing to stay. A single unchanging man loving a single unchanging woman for 50 years would be, in some sense, a smaller accomplishment than what he now believed had actually happened. A whole succession of men, each new and unfamiliar to the ones before, each one choosing her anew, out of freedom rather than mere inertia, because something in each successive version of him recognized something in each successive version of her worth choosing again. His daughter has children of her own now, and his son as well, and the old man has, in his later years, found himself in the curious position of being asked by his grandchildren the same kinds of questions he once asked himself in the dark, though they ask them with the particular fearlessness of the young who have not yet learned to be embarrassed by large questions. His eldest granddaughter, 12 years old and possessed of a seriousness that reminds him uncomfortably of himself at that age, asked him once, sitting beside him on the very same harbour wall where he had once sat beside his own doomed brother, whether he was scared of dying. He did not answer her quickly. He has learned, across 8 decades, that the questions children ask most plainly are usually the ones that deserve the least glib response, precisely because children have not yet learned to expect a glib response and will notice more readily than an adult would if they've been given one. He told her about the ship. Not the philosopher's version, not the careful academic argument he had eventually read about in his old age, but the old sailor's version, the version passed down among men who worked wooden boats and understood plank replacement as a simple practical fact of maintenance rather than a philosophical puzzle, that a boat, kept long enough, kept well enough, has every one of its original planks replaced eventually, one at a time, over years, without ever once stopping being that boat, without ever once being hauled out of service to have its identity recertified. He told her that people were like this too, that the boy he had been at her age was gone, materially speaking, gone the way the original planks of an old boat are gone, scattered, rotted, replaced. But that something else had continued the whole time, something that was not made of matter at all, something more like the shape of a life, the particular pattern one boy's choices and losses and loves had traced across 81 years, a pattern that had never once broken, even while every material thing that pattern was drawn upon kept changing beneath it. She asked him, with the directness only a child manages, whether that meant he wasn't really scared then. And he told her the truth, which is that he was not entirely sure, that some nights he still felt something like the old fear from his 20s returning briefly to visit, uninvited, the way an old friend sometimes turns up at your door long after you assumed the friendship had quietly ended. But that he had come to believe something had already survived every death he had already lived through, the death of the boy, the death of the young sailor, the death of the young husband, the death of the exhausted young father, the death of every single version of himself that circumstances and time had asked him to leave behind, and that whatever this something was, this pattern, this shape, this story, it had never once failed to make it across to the next version of him, not in 81 years, and he saw no particular reason, standing at the edge of his final years, to believe it would suddenly fail him now, at the one crossing that mattered most. He does not know if this comforted her. He is not sure it needs to, exactly, in the way children's questions do not always require comfort so much as honesty delivered gently. What he does know is that she sat with him a long while after that, in silence, watching the same boats leave the harbour that he had watched leave 1,000 mornings before her, that his father had watched leave before him, that some version of some child would likely watch leave long after both of them were gone, the harbour itself outliving every single hand that had ever fished from it, the water indifferent to any of their questions, moving in and out with the tide the way it always had, the way it always would, whether or not anyone was left standing on the wall to ask it what it meant. The old man believes now, at 81, something he could not have believed at 20 or even at 50, that the question of whether he is the same person who built toy boats in a tide pool was never actually the important question. The important question was always what he chose to carry forward, link by link, plank by plank, from each self to the next. Fear was carried forward and became, eventually, a kind of hard-won steadiness. Grief was carried forward and became, eventually, a kind of tenderness he would not otherwise have had access to. Love was carried forward and, astonishingly, somehow grew rather than thinned with each transfer, the way a story grows richer each time it is retold by someone who has lived a little more since the last telling, rather than poorer, the way he had once feared it might. He finishes his coffee most mornings now the way he always has, watching the boats leave, an old man built of entirely different matter than the boy who once feared the very water these boats sail out onto every day without a second thought. He does not know, some mornings, whether he is the same person that boy was. He has stopped needing to know. He knows only that something is still sailing, that it has never once, in 81 years, stopped, and that whatever the material of the hull is made of on any given morning, the shape of the voyage remains entirely, unmistakably his own. There is a stretch of years, earlier still, in his early 20s, that the old man rarely speaks of, not because they were shameful, but because they belong to a category of memory that resists narration the way a bruise resists being touched directly, willing to be approached only from the side. He was 22 when the call came for men of the harbour towns to serve, and he went, as nearly every young man of his generation went, without much internal debate, since the debate had already been settled for him by the accident of being born in a particular decade in a particular country, a fact no more chosen by him than the colour of his eyes. He does not tell war stories, and this script will not manufacture any for him, because the old man himself has always distrusted the neatness of war stories, the way they arrange chaos into narrative, complete with rising action and a moral, when the actual experience of those years had felt to him like nothing so much as a long fog with occasional violent clearings, after which the fog simply resumed. What he will say when his grandchildren ask, which they do less often now that they are old enough to sense his reluctance, is that he came home a different man than the one who left, and that this time the difference was not gradual, not plank by plank, but sudden and total, the way a single wave can reshape an entire stretch of coastline in one storm, undoing in an afternoon what might otherwise have taken 100 years of ordinary tides. He has thought, across the decades since, about what exactly it means to say he came home different. He was gone barely 3 years. 3 years is nothing against a lifespan of 80-odd, a fraction so small it should, by any reasonable accounting, register as a minor fluctuation rather than a total refounding of the self. And yet he has never doubted that the man who returned to the harbour town at 25 was not continuous with the man who had left it at 22 in any way that felt smooth or plank by plank at all. There was a break. He felt it as a break at the time, a felt discontinuity, a sense of having to reintroduce himself to his own parents, his own siblings, even to the harbour itself, which had not changed while he was gone, but which he now saw through eyes that had changed enormously, so that the harbour, ironically, seemed like the thing that had transformed, when it was in fact only him. He has wondered, reading later in life about the philosophy of persons, whether this felt discontinuity was itself a kind of illusion, whether the change had, in fact, still happened gradually, day by accumulating day, even during those 3 years, and had simply felt sudden only in retrospect, the way a very slow avalanche can feel, to someone watching from a great enough distance, like a single instantaneous event when up close it was always a sequence of small failures in the snowpack, one grain shifting against another, long before any visible motion began. He suspects this is closer to the truth than the feeling of suddenness suggested at the time. but he also holds stubbornly to the felt experience of the break, because a life is not only the sum of what actually happened to it in some objective sense. A life is also, and perhaps primarily, the sum of what it felt like from the inside, and from the inside something in him broke and was rebuilt in those 3 years, whether or not a slow-motion camera would have shown a smooth curve instead of a cliff. When he came home, Maren was still there, still unmarried, though 2 other young men from the town had by then asked for her hand and been quietly refused, a fact he did not learn until years into the marriage, when she told him almost as a joke, watching for his reaction with the particular amused patience she reserved for testing whether he would take himself, or her past, too seriously. He did not. He had learned by then that jealousy over a person's history is a kind of arrogance, a demand that the self you fell in love with should have sprung into existence only at the moment you arrived to receive it fully formed, with no other chapters before your own. He knew by then that no one works that way. He had, after all, been 3 or 4 different men himself by the time he came home from the war, and he could hardly begrudge Maren the very same right to have been shaped by chapters that had nothing to do with him. They married the year after his return, not the year of his return as he had originally planned, because he had needed those 12 months, he later understood, simply to become someone capable of standing steadily enough at an altar to make a promise he intended to keep. There is a kind of humility in this that he did not appreciate at the time and appreciates enormously now, the wisdom, at 25, of waiting until the newest version of himself had settled enough to be trusted with vows, rather than making those vows in haste on behalf of a self still too raw and unfinished to know what it was actually promising. His working life after the war shifted, slowly, from the deck of the boats to the harbour itself. His knees had begun, even by his 30s, to complain in a way they had not complained in his youth, old injuries from those brutal early years under Aldrich announcing themselves each winter with increasing insistence, and by the time he reached his 40s he had moved from sailing the boats to managing the harbour's daily operations, instead assigning berths, checking manifests, settling disputes between crews over fishing grounds and nets tangled in the night. It was, by his own admission, less romantic work than sailing had been, and he grieved this loss quietly for a few years, the way a man grieves the gradual retirement of a body that used to do things without complaint and now negotiates every task. But he came, eventually, to love the harbour work in its own right, because it let him watch, for the remainder of his career, the same boats leaving each morning that he had once crewed himself, and there was something in this, some satisfaction in being the man who remained on shore, tending the practical machinery that let the younger men go out and do what he no longer could. It is this history, more than any other single fact, that explains why an old man sits on the harbour wall every morning of his retirement, watching boats leave that he will never again sail on. It is not merely nostalgia, though there is certainly some of that in it. It is closer to a kind of ongoing vigil, a continuation, in reduced form, of 40 years spent making sure those same boats left safely and returned the same way, a habit of attention so deeply worn into him that retirement did not remove it, only relocated it from an office with a desk and a manifest book to a low stone wall with a cup of coffee. There is a further piece of this old man's history worth setting down here, because it touches directly on the question this whole narrative has been circling from the beginning, and because it happened only in the last decade of his life, recently enough that he still carries it close to the surface rather than buried under the sediment of decades. At 74, he had a health scare that the family still refers to, with the particular understatement families develop around their worst frights, as the trouble with his heart. It was, in fact, close to fatal. He collapsed one morning on this very harbour wall, in front of 2 fishermen he had known for 30 years, and was not entirely certain, for some minutes afterward, hazy and disoriented on the cold stone with faces bending over him and someone shouting for a phone, whether he was dying. He remembers, oddly, not fear in that moment, but a kind of intense, almost clinical curiosity and observer's interest in his own condition that surprised him even as he was experiencing it, as though some part of his mind had stepped slightly to one side to watch the rest of him with detached fascination. He survived, obviously, or this account would not exist to be told. But the weeks of recovery that followed did something to his sense of himself that even the war had not managed to do, because the war had changed him through addition, through experience piled onto experience, while the heart trouble changed him through subtraction, through a sudden, vivid encounter with his own eventual absence. He lay in a hospital bed for the better part of 2 weeks, his body performing its recovery according to a schedule entirely indifferent to his wishes, and he had, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, nothing at all to do but think. He thought about the boy in the tide pools. He thought about Aldrich, dead now for 50 years, whose face he could no longer perfectly recall, though he could recall, with total clarity, the single grunt of approval Aldrich had once given him after the boy correctly read a squall. He thought about his brother, drowned young, and about Marin, and about the particular grain of the wood on their kitchen table, warm smooth in one spot from 50 years of her hand resting there while she read in the evenings. He thought most of all about a question that the near death of the storm at 19 had first raised, and that the near death of his heart at 74 now raised again, decades later, with a very different weight to it. If he had died on that wall, which version of himself would have died? The 19-year-old sailor, still lodged somewhere within him as a kind of foundational layer. The young husband? The exhausted father? Or only the most recent version, the 74-year-old retired harbor manager, as though all the earlier men had already, quietly, finished their own deaths decades before, and only this final tenant remained to be evicted. He came, in that hospital bed, to a conclusion that has stayed with him since, one he has never fully managed to explain to his children in a way that satisfies them, though his grandchildren, oddly, seem to grasp it more readily, perhaps because children have not yet been trained out of comfort with paradox. The conclusion was this: that all of these questions, however you resolved them, missed the actual point of what dying would mean. Dying would not mean the destruction of some single, particular self that had persisted and changed since childhood, because no such self had ever existed to be destroyed. That self had always been a sequence, a chain, a fleet of vessels handing cargo from one to the next across a long crossing. What dying would actually mean was simpler and, in a way, both more frightening and less frightening than the elaborate philosophical puzzle he had built around it for decades. It would mean that the chain, whatever it had been made of, would simply stop being extended. No new link would be forged. The voyage, having sailed under many different hulls across 80-some years, each one built from the wreckage and salvage of the one before, would at last make no further landfall, would add no further chapter, and everything that had already been carried this far, every love, every grief, every plank of memory and habit and unconscious inherited posture, would come, at that point, not to an erasure exactly, since erasure implies something being actively undone, but to a simple, quiet cessation of further building. He found, oddly, that this was easier to bear than the fear he had carried around for decades, the fear rooted in a much older and, he now believed, mistaken picture, the picture of a single unchanging self, present since childhood, that death would somehow reach backward through time to annihilate retroactively, undoing not just the future but somehow the entire past as well, as though his own death might reach back and make even the boy in the tide pools, even the storm at 19, even the wedding, even Marin's hand on his in the dark. That picture, he came to feel, was the one truly unbearable one, and it was also, he now believed, simply false. Whatever had happened had happened. The boy had built his boats. The storm had been survived. The marriage had been lived fully by a whole succession of men who had each, in turn, chosen to stay. None of that would be unmade by his death any more than the early chapters of a long book are unmade by the simple fact that the book eventually ends. The ending does not reach backward and erase the middle. It simply arrives, and then there is no more page after it, and the story that exists up to that point remains exactly what it was, exactly as real, exactly as complete in itself as it had ever been while still being written. He came home from the hospital a slightly different man again, as he always had after each of these great disruptions, though slighter in degree this time than after the storm or the war, since he was old now, and old men's transformations he has noticed tend to be quieter, more a matter of emphasis and priority shifting than of wholesale rebuilding. He found that he had less patience for old grudges, several of which he let go of within months of returning home, grudges he had nursed for years against a cousin over an inheritance dispute, against an old friend over a slight so minor neither of them, on later reflection, could fully reconstruct what had actually been said. He found he had more patience, by contrast, for his grandchildren's long, meandering stories about school and friendships and the small dramas of childhood, stories he might once have only half listened to while thinking of something else, and now found himself fully present for, aware in some new way the heart trouble had opened in him, that these ordinary afternoons of listening were themselves the substance of a life, not merely the space between more important events. There is a further philosophical thread the old man encountered in his final years, again by way of that same grandson and his habit of leaving provocative reading material open on household screens, this one concerning a strange thought experiment involving a machine that could, hypothetically, take a person entirely apart at the level of atoms in one location and reconstruct an identical arrangement of atoms at a distant location, the original then destroyed. The philosopher who proposed this puzzle asked whether the person emerging from the machine at the far end was truly the same person who had entered it, or merely an extraordinarily convincing copy, a new person who happened to believe falsely that they were the old one, carrying all the old memories and habits and loves but none of the actual continuous material or perhaps actual continuous consciousness of the person who had stepped into the machine. The old man found this puzzle, at first, almost comically abstract, the kind of thing a young person with too much free time and no actual mortality yet breathing down their neck might enjoy debating over drinks. But sitting with it longer, in the particular unhurried way old age had finally given him leave to sit with things, he began to see that this fantastical machine was not so different from the machine he had, in fact, been passing through his whole life, one slow morning at a time. Every night he had ever slept, his body had performed something not entirely unlike this teleportation, disassembling and reassembling its molecular furniture bit by bit across the years, never all at once the way the philosopher's machine proposed, but cumulatively arriving, decade after decade, at exactly the same destination, a person built of entirely different matter than the one who had originally set out, carrying the same memories, or at least memories that felt continuous with the old ones, believing himself to be the same person the boy in the tide pools had been, with no machine involved at all beyond the ordinary, ceaseless churn of cellular replacement that every human body performs invisibly every single day, without any of us ever once being consulted about whether we consent to the process. If the man stepping out of the philosopher's imagined machine was merely a very convincing copy and not the true original, then the old man realized, with a mixture of vertigo and strange calm, that he himself, sitting on this harbor wall at 81, might have to accept the very same verdict about himself, that he was not, in the strictest material sense, the same person as the boy who had once been afraid of deep water, but only an extraordinarily convincing successor built from that boy's discarded material and equipped with a plausible feeling set of continuous memories, sincerely and completely believing himself to be the original, when in fact the original had in some sense ended long ago and simply never noticed its own ending because each replacement had been too gradual, too well disguised as continuity, to register as loss. He sat with this for a long time, on many mornings, before deciding, finally, that he did not much mind the verdict either way. If he was the original, wonderful, the boy in the tide pools had, against considerable odds, made it all the way to 81. And if he was, instead, merely the latest in a very long chain of convincing successors, each one inheriting the last one's memories and loves and unfinished business the way an heir inherits an estate, then this too struck him, on reflection, as something worth calling a kind of survival, even if it was not the kind the old philosophies had promised. An heir is not the same person as the one who left them the inheritance, but an heir who receives the whole estate intact and undiminished, and chooses to keep tending it exactly as it was always meant to be tended, is doing something that deserves, he came to feel, nearly the same name as survival, even if it is not, strictly, identical to it. His grandson, the one responsible for so much of this late-life philosophical unsettling, asked him once with the slightly combative energy of a young man testing whether his grandfather's mind still had any fight left in it, whether all of this thinking hadn't simply talked him out of caring about his own death at all, whether the whole elaborate architecture of continuity and inheritance and successive selves wasn't, in the end, just an elaborate excuse to stop being afraid of something a person ought by rights to remain afraid of. The old man thought about this question longer than his grandson expected him to, long enough that the boy began to suspect he had genuinely wounded the old man's certainty. But the answer, when it came, was neither defensive nor evasive. He said that he was still afraid, some nights, in the old animal way that no amount of philosophy fully cures, the way the body itself seems to hold a fear that argument cannot entirely reach, buried too deep for reasoning to excavate. But that this fear, real as it was, had stopped being the largest thing in the room. What had grown larger over 8 decades was something closer to gratitude that the chain had been extended as far as it had, gratitude for every plank that had ever been laid down and for every hand, his own included, across every version of himself, that had done the laying. He told his grandson that a person does not need to solve the puzzle of personal identity in order to live a life worth calling continuous. The solving, he had come to believe, was never really the point. The sailing was the point. It always had been. He is 81 now, as this account has said more than once, because 81 does not stay 81 for very long, and soon enough this account itself will need updating, the way every account of a living person always does, right up until the moment it doesn't need updating anymore, at which point it becomes, finally and for the first time, a complete and finished thing, not a person continuing to sail, but a record of a voyage that has come, at last, into harbour. That day has not yet arrived for the old man on the wall. He finishes his coffee. He watches the boats go out, exactly as he has watched them go out for most of 8 decades, under many different hulls, carrying many different names, all of them somehow, against every strict material accounting, still recognizably his own ship sailing on.